Okay, welcome to the main course. So this is going to be where we're going to make the final project. There's obviously going to be some more things that I'm going to talk to you about and educate you on how to navigate and around the scene. But you do have a good introduction and a good overview now that you should be able to follow along quite well. Now, at some points we will hit some technical parts which may be quite complicated to understand. So please don't get disheartened and think, oh, I'm so bad at it, I don't understand. But I don't expect you to understand everything that you're doing here. There is definitely a steep learning curve inside of Blender, but you will get there in the end. It just takes you a few projects just to get your head around a few certain concepts, but there will definitely be a point where it all clicks and suddenly it all starts making sense. I really didn't understand UV unwrapping for a very long time, and at one point I realized that it was no longer an issue, that I no longer even thought about it being a problem. But when I do look back on it, I was definitely thinking, I'm never going to understand this. This is so complicated. But don't worry, if you hit a point which you really don't understand, but you can follow along and you can get it completed just by copying what I do, that is more than enough that you need to know for this course. The idea is that I want to show you key concepts and key parts of the software just so you know that that exists, so that when you go ahead with your projects, you already have a base understanding of how this thing might work, so you can experiment with it and push it forwards to the next level yourself. But maybe you do follow it, and maybe I do explain it very well, and you do get a very good idea of how it works, but this 3D software is very vast and there's lots to learn, so really don't worry if you don't get it the first time. So let's go ahead and get started. So first thing we need to do is add a camera. Now if you are starting a project which involves getting some architectural plans from a customer, they might send you the floor plan and then you might make that floor plan correctly, and then once that's created, then you add the camera. So you might find the perfect position and then you add the camera. But I already know what the final product's going to be. So what I'm going to do is add the camera first, because I already know where I want it to be. Now, I do want the camera facing this way, and there are certain ways to make your camera snap to these directions. So if I want to look directly this way, I can press 1 on the number pad. To look this way, I can press 3 on the number pad. If I want to look down, I can press 7. And if I want to go to perspective or orthographic view, I can press 5. So now this is like a perspective view, all the lines go off into the distance. If I press 5 this way, they all eventually converge in the distance. But I can also press these buttons here to go straight, left, top, bottom, for example. So if I want to add a camera going straight that way, the first thing I'm going to do is do Shift A to add an object, and then we go down to here to add a camera. Then once that's camera added, you'll notice that the camera's been added facing whichever way my screen's looking. So if I add a camera here, it's going to be looking in this direction, but that's not what we want. So I'm going to have to edit this in some way. So if I go to the top view and do this, I can press R and rotate it like this and hold down the Shift key to rotate it in a smaller increments. I can then go to this view and try to do it like this and try to get it exactly facing this way. But I'll find it very, very, very difficult to actually get it perfect. So if I press N to bring up this menu here, this is giving me some information about the direction the camera is facing. And we can see that it's got really crazy numbers going off here. So I need to change that. So these one, I'm going to set to 0, 0, and if I set this to 0, camera's going to facing straight down, so I want it to be up this way at 90 degrees. There we go. And this is a very, very precise way about moving your object. You can also do it with location and scales. Rotation and everything is very precise here, so this is very useful. I'm just going to close that again. Now, to go into the camera view, I can press this button here, or I can press 0 on the number pad. And now we're inside the camera. Now if there were no cameras in the scene and I press 0, nothing's going to happen because there's no camera. As soon as you add one camera, that one camera is always going to be the main camera. But if there were two cameras, you'll notice that one has a dark filled in triangle where the other one doesn't. So that is saying that this is the main camera. So if I go into here, that's the camera that I'm going to go into. If you want this one to be the main camera, you can do Control and 0 and that will become the main camera, or view, cameras, set active object as camera, and then you can see that changing. But not only that, we can also change it over here to say this is the main camera, this is the main camera. So if we're in this view, we can quickly switch to the next camera by pressing this button here. And now you can see that we are switching between. So let's just delete that one for now. We do only need one camera, but now you do know that exists. So now I'm going to go into the camera with it selected. If you haven't got it selected, you can click on this edge here, like this, or click on it up here and press G, Z and move it on the Z axis, and you can see the grid on the floor moving away. So just so I can move it something like this, just so I can see what's going on in the scene. Right then, now I'm going to start adding some objects, and in my final render there is some stairs, so I'm going to start making the stairs now. And the first thing we need to think about is which object shall we add to start with, which best represents the object we finally want to create. So let's say we want to make a bottle or a vase. We can do Shift A to add objects. We can go to Mesh and we can look which one of these looks most like a vase. Well, this one I think looks most like a vase. So we can scale this in, we can move that in, we can inset this, and there we go, we have a vase. So that would fit that object best. Now for a staircase, you might think a cube, or we might even have a plane. So a cube on its own, this is going to be the top face and this could be the front face. We have all this stuff on the outside edge and the bottom, which might get in the way in some point, whereas the only part of the stairs we can see is the top and side edge. Now we can make some stairs from this, but what I do think is that to start with, it might be easier to start with a plane. Now a plane is basically the top side of a staircase. So if I do this, we can see that we now have some stairs. But the stairs that I have in this image, they kind of are on a square. So it's like square stairs. So that's what I'm going to try to create now. So I'm going to press the backslash, if that's what the name is, on the number pad, or I can go to View, Local View, and toggle Local View. And that will highlight just this object. So if there's lots of stuff in the scene and it's all getting in the way and I really want to edit this one, but all the stuff's in the way, I can just go to here and just solo that object. There's also another thing that we can do. Let's say we've got loads and loads of panels open. It's really hard to see. I'm in local view, but it's still not quite big enough. I can hold down Control and press space, and now we've basically soloed this whole window. So now we can only see this window with no distractions, but you'll notice that there's a new thing at the top here called Back to Previous, and it will go back to how it was. So I can do Control and space, and we can go back into here. Now I do forget that this exists all the time, actually. And I do find that if I ever want to modify one object, I generally just slide things over and then it's fine. But that is just good to know. Sometimes you might be working on one object for the next 2 hours. It might just be nice just to solo that and go into that. So we can see this object. Now how do we turn this into some staircase? So the first thing I need to do is actually go into edit mode. So I'm going to press tab to go into edit mode because I want to edit the object itself. There's not much I can really do with this in object mode because I can't really edit the individual points. I could perhaps go to a side, select it. I can maybe duplicate it with Shift D. I can then rotate it 90 degrees. Then I can maybe move it into place, and then I can select both and do Control J to join them again. And now we're starting to get some staircase, but you can imagine that this isn't probably the most efficient way to do this. So let's just go back into edit mode with tab, and we can get these individual vertices. So with any modeling task, there's going to be 100 different ways to approach this. There could be fast methods, there could be slow methods, there could be methods which you prefer and methods other people do not prefer. The thing is, the end result is the only thing that matters. And what I'm going to do here is one thing which I think works pretty well, and I can teach you how extrude and inset and everything works. So that's the way I'm going to do it. So I'm going to select this face select with 3. I'm going to select this one, and then I'm going to press I, which is inset, which is this one. I'm going to do 0.15. And then I'm going to do E, and then 0.15, I, 0.15, E, 0.15, I, 0.15, and then E, 0.15. And there we go, we have some stairs. So if you'll notice that when I pressed E, it's always locked to the Z axis, but that's actually referring to the direction that face is already looking. So if I move this over here, press face select, and then press E, you'll see it's then extruding to this direction. So it's always going to take into account that face direction. Now I want to bring all of these down, so I can select them all like that, and then press E, but you'll notice it's loose. It's like it's not giving me any direction. So I need to tell it the direction. I'm going to press Z, and then that's going to go straight down. The reason why that's happened is because there's no face here. There's no face for it to understand which direction it should be going. It could be going this direction or another direction. So it's just giving me loose, and then I just need to press the direction I want it to go. Now, you might have noticed that when I selected all of them, I held down Shift and I could click all of them independently. But there are a bunch of different tools inside of Blender that allow you to do that much quicker. So let's just delete these. So if I want to select this whole loop, it's called an edge loop because they loop around. I can hold down Alt and then click on one of them, and it will try to find the whole loop. It will do the same thing here. If I click on this one, it will find the whole loop. And if I try to do the top, it hasn't quite worked out. There's some kind of modeling caveats which might change how certain things work, and that's because there's like 3 points that connect here rather than 4. So Blender doesn't really know which direction the flow should go, so it's not going to let me try to select this whole edge top. However, if I extruded this up, Now, at this point, there's 4 connecting edges. So now if I did it, it did know which one to do. So if you, for some reason that's not working, perhaps you're selecting an edge which doesn't have an actual edge flow per se. But that's kind of a little bit more complicated for you to know now. For now, we just want to select this edge. I'm going to do E, Z, 0.15. It's gone up, so I'm going to press minus, and then it's going to go down. There we go. And I'm going to press F to fill that in, and now we have a beautiful staircase. Now, one thing to know about life, really anything, is that every object, no matter how close you get to it, is always going to have some sort of bevel. And bevel is a smoothing of the edges. Whereas this, no matter how far I zoom in, I'm never going to find the point. Even a knife, if you were to zoom into the sharpest knife in the world, it will look something like this. It will be blunt. It won't go to an exact point. Nothing in the world really does. Maybe graphene is one of the only things that goes to a single point. But there's always going to be bevel. So we want to add some bevel, and it's time for us to work on some more modifiers. So modifiers are, as I've already mentioned in the other section, is that modifiers are a great way to add geometry to the object in a non-destructive way. So if I was to go into edit mode, there is a bevel tool here. So if I was to do that, Control B, bevel all of these, use the scroll wheel to add some geometry, and I think, okay, that looks pretty good, and then I go do some other things, and then I think, oh, actually I want the bevel to be a bit thicker. Well, now I can't change this bevel to be thicker. That's not possible. So now that's baked into the object, what can I do? Well, that's where modifiers can save the day. So if I go over to the modifier menu, go to add a modifier, I can click generated and click on bevel, or I can just click search and just type bevel. Now we can see that there's a bevel modifier and it's smoothing it all out, and I can just bring that down. If I hold down shift to bring it in slowly, I can do something like this, and then I can go in and I can add a few more segments, and there we go. We have some bevel, and we can change this later on if we wanted to. We can adjust this as much as we like. Now, you might notice that there's some sharp edges here, but we want this to be smooth. So you might remember we can do right click, shade smooth, but there's some strange shading. It might be very subtle, especially when you're just learning this, but it kind of looks like this edge has got some sort of curvature. Let me go back, shade flat, we can see it's dead flat. Shade smooth is kind of averaged it all out. So if you remember, shade smooth basically tries to find an average of all the faces. So at this face, it's trying to average out this, and it's going to make this look a little bit bent in the side. But that's not what we want. So we want this to have a flat face. There are some ways that you can do this, such as adding some extra loops with Control R and clicking and dragging this in, and you can see the shading changes as I go like this. If you look slightly to the left of this orange line, there's like a brighter edge that gets pushed and pushed and pushed to the edge. I can do the same thing here and push it to the edge. Now this face looks more flat than these faces because I'm giving it more geometry. I'm basically giving Blender more information to understand how this edge should look. So it's only going to average out these bits, but then this bit's definitely going to be flat. But that starts adding some more geometry, and that does work for some objects. But there's also often a lot of tools which Blender can use to speed this up. So instead of adding lots of loops like this on all the surfaces, I'm going to look inside the bevel modifier and see if there's a button I can press, and there is, called shading, harden normals. Now it's saying, a bit warning, enable auto smooth in object data properties, which I can find under here, object data properties, and then under normals, auto smooth. I can enable it here, or I can go right click, auto smooth. And that's basically going to say it will smooth everything that is under 30 degrees. If it goes over 30 degrees, then it will consider it a sharp edge, and then it will not smooth that. But that alongside this, which is harden normals, that bevel modifier is telling it that at the very edge of the bevel modifier effect, it's going to add a sharp edge. So it's going to tell it anything after this bevel needs to be flat, and auto smooth can read that. So that's what's happened now. So you can see now, if I go shade smooth and shade auto smooth, you can see these surfaces flattening out. So I'm going to do that, and there we go. We now have a smooth edge and a flat edge. Now if I didn't do this and I shaded flat, to make this smooth I'll need to add so much geometry, which can slow down Blender, which is completely unnecessary. So let's go back to this and shade auto smooth. There we go. So now we have a staircase, and we want to add that to our scene. So let's go back, another pad like this, and we can start to build the scene with the staircase. So I'm going to press the 0 on the number pad, and actually I want everything to be in line with this because it makes it a bit easier. So I'm going to do Shift C. I'm going to move the cursor to the center. I'm going to select this object. I'm going to do Shift S, selection to cursor. That will move this to the camera to the center point. Then I can do GZ and move that up. Now I know that that's in the center. This is also in the center, so it'll make it easier to align things in the future. Now I do want to move this over here, but I also want to see what's inside the camera at the same time. Because if I go in here, I want to move this into place, but it's a little bit hard in the camera view. So I'm going to leave this camera view here. I'm going to go over to here, and then I'm going to go to this view. I'm going to change this to 3D viewport. Now anything I do over here is going to reflect over here, but I can concentrate what's happening in the camera view. But before I do that, I should probably actually change the image dimensions. So over here, I want this to actually be portrait. So this is landscape, so it's wider at the bottom and top than it is the sides. But I want it to be the other way around, so it can go onto social media or be a mobile phone wallpaper or something like that. So let's switch these around. 1080 by 1920. But I think that might be a little bit too narrow, so let's increase this to 1340. I think that was the dimensions that my phone takes a photo, so I'll do something like that. But you can also, you're kind of free to do this as you like, but I think this should work. And then the other thing to note is that when you look through a camera, I think it's called a viewfinder, you do not see the stuff outside of what the camera is going to see. The same as if your phone taking a photo. If you get your camera out, what you see on the screen is what the photo is going to be. So if you don't see any distractions when you're taking those photos, why should you get any distractions inside of Blender? Well, let's turn that off. So I'm going to click on the camera. So it's got orange outline. You can see a new button's appeared for the camera, and then we can go to viewport display. So that's going to change a few things inside of the viewport, because this is the 3D viewport, which might make it easier to hide the outside edge. So there's a thing called here called PASP2. I think that's correct. That's basically when you look at a picture frame on the wall and they have that white outline which the photo sits inside. That's basically that. So if I turn this to full, we now can no longer see the outside distracting edges. So now we can concentrate on what goes on inside of here. So let's just move this over here. Let's just turn off statistics on here because it's taking up too much space. There we go. So we have this object, so let's put this into place. So let's move this over here. But I think I might actually make it a little bit longer. So I can stretch this like this, but you'll see that these steps end up becoming longer than these steps. But I want it to be in proportion with everything else. So I'm going to press tab to go into edit mode, Z wireframe, 1 for vertex select. Then I'm just going to select these ones and press G and Y. So now I can move this over with everything still being in the same proportions. So something like this, move this over. And now I want to start mirroring this object. So what I can do is duplicate this over here and duplicate this one over here, but I want this all to be mirrored exactly. So if I edit this part, it will edit this part, and the same as these parts and these parts. So I do have one object created, and to save a lot of time, the mirror modifier is great because you just edit one and it'll edit both. So I briefly touched on these origin points in the past. So these tiny points are basically telling it where the center of the object is, and some modifiers do make use of that. So if I go to this one and add a generate mirror, you'll see nothing's happened because it's basically mirroring on the X axis of this object, and because the origin point is in the center of that point, you're not going to see anything. But if I mirror on the Y axis, we can see that it is mirroring, and you can actually see what's happening. And all the same with the Z axis. If I was to do that, we can see that it's then mirroring on the Z axis. So if we move this origin point, the mirror will then change. So I can click over here, I can hold down Shift, click the right button, and then this cursor goes here. I can right click on this object, do set origin to 3D cursor. Now we can see that the origin has changed, but now if I do click here, we can see it's moved over there. But I want it to be mirrored exactly on the Y axis. So what I could do is do Shift C to move the cursor exactly to the center, so we know it's going to be there. Then I can do right click, set origin to 3D cursor, and now we can see that this object moves over very slightly, because I think it looks like I actually got it pretty close to the final point. And there we go. So now that's over here. But now if I wanted to mirror on this axis, it's going to be too far over here. So in this case, I'm going to go into edit mode, select all, and just press G and Y and bring this in, something like this. And then bring this back over here. There is also another option. Let's say I bring this over here. I can do Shift S cursor to selected. Now the cursor is in the center, and I can use another object as the mirror object. So if I do Shift A and then go to empty add plane arrows. Now I can set this, which is an empty, as the mirror point. Now empties are great. You'll use them for many different things. You can use it to parent objects, you can use it as a pivot point, you can use it for modifiers and all sorts. So I'm just going to bring this over here somewhere where I want it to be roughly in the center. Click this object, then I'm going to set the mirror object to be this point. Now if I move this anywhere around, you can see that it's actually affecting the mirror modifier, and this is great. So this gives us a lot of freedom. We can very quickly do it. We can very quickly change it without having to change the origin point of this actual object. So let's just bring this out over here. So there's kind of an even distance, something like this. Let's select them both, because if you only select one, you're going to end up with a big mess. So we need to make sure we hold down Shift to select both, so they both move together, because they both kind of have some sort of relationship. And we bring this over like that. There we go, we have some steps. So maybe the camera should be a little bit higher, something like this. And then maybe I can move them both over. Yes, I guess something like that should be fine. Right then, I think that's that for the steps. I think now might be appropriate for us to make the archway.